Yeah, sorry about that. It froze for some reason. I don't know why it does this. Also, it doesn't help that I'm not the greatest with technology. Hold on while I pull up.
Determinism.
It still doesn't pull it up, and I pulled up just before. It just decides not to pull up sometimes. It's weird.
Determinism to act.
It's gonna keep happening. Okay, finally. Don't know why that couldn't have worked earlier, but it's working now. It is working now. Okay. So I'm just going to be doing this kind of in the background. I'm going to be pulling up this video. This is obviously a reply to cosmic schmectic and determinism and things like that. So hopefully everyone can hear me well now. Or now, rather. Hopefully everyone can hear me well while I begin this video.
Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Prespective Philosophy. If you're new here, my name is Lewis and I'm a PhD student studying philosophy. In today's episode, we are going to be discussing the problem of free will and determinism. This video is actually going to be in response to Cosmic Skeptic Alex's video on determinism and compatibilism. So if you haven't seen them, I do recommend checking them out. I'll be framing my argument around Alex's argument for two primary reasons. One, because I think his argument is probably the most common I see today. And the second reason is because it's very similar to the approach that I used to take when I was an undergraduate. So first, we will be discussing why determinism is untrue. Then we will make this video, which is that we are free, is essentially the that human thought and action result from a prior cause. Think of it like this. The reason I am eating,
we all know what determinism
arose from prior causes. Now, that's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it could be that it arose because God determined it to be so. But they all rely upon the same thing, a governance of human behavior from a law-like structure. What I will argue is that there can never be a law-like structure, that there can never be a cause and effect relationship which can determine the next step within a mind or society. This runs parallel to forms of sociology and psychology, which argues that...
So, that's basically where I wanted to sort of begin with this video. The idea that there could never be a causal structure related to the mind seems very wrong to me. I have no idea why Prespective philosophy holds this view. And then I also have no idea why people think that determinism is going to bar them necessarily from free will. But I can see some sort of perspectives that are anti-deterministic, like Kant's system, which postulates something like a noumenal or transcendental subject, that the regularities or the norms or whatever you want to call it, the properties of a mind are in a way for Kant, and maybe even for Hegel, of a certain type of quality that would not be compatible with determinism altogether. And so if you take a very hard Kantian approach, there's something about the mind that has autonomy, has free will, has a sort of self-determining, self-motivating, self-causing action. It's its own cause for its own effect, its own effect for its own cause. But I'm not really sure if that's the perspective that Prespective philosophy is taking. So we'll continue.
That human behavior is scientifically analyzable, that it can be known and predicted, like the movements of planetary bodies in the solar system. A law-like structure of human behavior would be able to predict human action within the future, whether it's individualistic, of how I will behave tomorrow, or whether it's sociological, how we will behave in the next 10 years, the way that society will progress, and so on. So, running with the scientific paradigm that is most common today, science relies upon a deductive methodology called the scientific method. So what the scientific method is a form of philosophy. It's actually a deductive methodology used to test an individual's hypothesis for truth value, whether the proposition actually obtains truth value. So what we can see is that science is a body of knowledge. Science is not the way the world is. Science is how we think the world is. Science relies upon human engagement within reality to come to knowledge claims about reality.
Yeah, so those types of statements that science is not really how our models are like, they're just representations or whatever. You know, this type of view of where you create a sort of disjunction, a wedge in between appearance and reality. I don't know why perspective philosophy is holding this view. In my opinion, the Hegelian view is just to say that there's an identity between our appearances and reality, and that appearances are appearances of some underlying feature of reality. Now, it might be the case that we don't have an completely accurate experience of the world, but a lack of a complete explanation of the world does not mean it's an erroneous explanation, right? So, asymptotically approaching something, that means you're getting some things right and you're getting some things wrong. Take a very common sense sort of approach on how science works in this sort of way. Since then, I'm a scientific realist. I thought that perspective philosophy is a scientific realist, so I'm not sure why he's jettisoning this sort of identity theory of truth.
Let's think about it. When a scientist comes across limestone, what do they think of it? What do they understand it to be? They understand it to be a rock, mineral, consisting primarily of calcium carbonate, which is itself consisting of calcium, carbon, and oxygen. Those calcium, carbon, and oxygen particles can then be broken down further into more fundamental particles. And eventually we will reach the point in which we will hit energy, where all of these fundamental particles are actually expressions of energy. And since energy cannot be created or destroyed, all of this energy is the result of energy transferals that have occurred all the way back to the Big Bang. So any limestone that you come across is the result of the Big Bang, just as any other material substance that you come across is again the result of prior causes leading back to the first cause, or an infinite regression of causes.
A story that really began 14 billion years ago, with a tiny universe where everything was all in one place. Then the Big Bang. All the energy that has ever existed, created in an instant.
So if science is the analysis of objects, and in particular material objects, what is an object? How do we understand it to be material?
I think it's a sort of crude view to say that science is the study of objects. Because what an object is sort of different from the types of, I think, different sort of types of things. I mean, if you even want to call them things that science deals with, they deal with processes, state of affairs, they deal with events sometimes, depending on how your theory of causation sort of is constructed. But I don't know if you can talk about electromagnetism as necessarily being an object. I don't know if you can talk about gravity as necessarily being an object, or if you believe in something like Sean Carroll does about there being things prior to the Big Bang, at least not temporally prior, but certain types of preconditions like gravity, then I'm not really sure if you can call those objects either. So there's an entire video that I've made about exactly resisting the idea of object-oriented ontology, or oriented ontology, sorry. Sometimes British people say orientated. So I'm not sure if science is the study of objects, but this is a small little point that I wanted to get kind of down.
Is that just given to us by nature? Do we look at a rock and instantly know that it's limestone? No. Instead, what we do is conceptualize. And in fact, this conceptualization process is actually the foundation of this entire universe, material or not. This means that the material universe is fundamentally dependent upon human idea. Let me explain. When you look up at the sky at night, what do you see? Do you see something that is pure sense data? The splashes of colour from the clouds, the light from the stars and the moon? Or do you see the moon, the stars, the clouds? What a cloud, a moon, or a star is not something given to us by our perception, but is something constructed within our minds and then applied to reality. There is no such thing as a star, a moon, or a cloud in reality. If we take reality to be that raw sense data, that experiential existence.
So this is interesting. I think also another type of view that's inconsistent with Hegelianism. There are no such things as stars, moons, things in the galaxy. These are just sort of conceptualizations. I can't tell if this is a form of nominalism or if this is a form of conceptualism, but it's definitely not a form of universalism in the sense that universals exist, which I don't think is I don't think that that's consistent with Hegel's view. One of the reasons is because we don't want to just say that holes, natural holes of any sort, whether it be electrons, protons, forms of electromagnetic events, whether we're talking about certain types of things like human beings, organisms, certain types of species. These are just sort of conceptual projections that we put upon the world, but rather that these are actually, in some sort of way, have what's called an ontological containment. An ontological containment means that there is something to differentiate between sets of objects or events or processes that would materially and mutually, let me repeat that last part. There is some sort of mutual incompatibility with these two different types of things that would demarcate them from being one and the same thing. So we wouldn't say certain things like rocks go through photosynthesis or humans go through photosynthesis, because there are certain types of processes or properties that we wouldn't be able to attribute to certain types of things. So when I see the world, I see certain types of holes everywhere, and these holes, or universals if you will, repeat themselves over and over and over. It seems to me that a rhinoceros is going to participate within its own species, that a tree is going to participate within its own species. There isn't something that, and we're not just sort of psychologically projecting certain types of concepts or demarcations onto the world. Rather, the world sort of presses itself upon us, setting these demarcations and these material incompatibilities within each other. And I think that that's what we're supposed to get from the idea of being realists about universals. Now, what seems to be, and I don't know how familiar everyone is with the literature here, but just seems to be a form of nominalism or a form of conceptualism, but we'll see if he backs down from it.
What reality is in that case is undefined and undefinable. Reality is instead, for us, when we engage in science, a conceptual endeavor. Reality is just as much idea as it is physical and material, which is actually why a lot of our theories are incorrect at first. Because if we were just abstracting truth from observation, then we wouldn't have any problems with being correct. It would just be given to us and handed to us by nature. But instead we have to think, construct new ideas, apply them, test them, and then see whether our defined parameters of these conceptual guidelines are actually fitting to reality. So reality at its best can never be reduced to a purely material cause. It has to be instead part conceptual, part idea.
I agree that if you look at the Aristotelian causes, since he brought up efficient and material causes, I don't think that the world, of course there are some people who do, can be reduced to material and efficient causes. And again, material causes just being like what the thing is made of. Is it made of steel? Is it made of wood? Is it made of iron? And efficient causes is basically things like one object hitting another, it being moved by that object, basically something like that picture. And then you get the other two causes within Aristotelian causation, which is formal and final causes, which they're basically teleology, which I do think that perspective philosophy believes in. and form, basically, that certain types of things have what you would equivalently call like a blueprint. A house has a bunch of content, a bunch of material to it that makes it a house that could possibly give rise to a house. But one thing that's similar between all houses, whether they're made of brick, steel, wood, or straw, is that they have a certain type of similar form. What that form is that we can dwell within that sort of setting. And presumably, forms can take on something analogous within the natural world, not just artifacts. So when we're talking about bodies, they're all going to exhibit homeostasis, metabolism. That's a certain type of functional form. They're going to do the things that they intend to do. So I definitely agree with him that efficient and material causes aren't reducible. Or the natural world isn't reducible to those types of things. But that doesn't follow that causation is just a sort of form of understanding only.
Kant was the first to show that the perceiver, to make the world intelligible, had to conceptualize it, that the world could not be itself given.
It's just definitely false. I mean, Kant wasn't the first one to think that.
To the agent, but instead must be constructed by the agent. The agent has to take an active process in understanding the world and creating the world as much as the world provides that information to the agent. The individual cannot just understand the world implicitly. This is why the individual lives in the world of the phenomena and not the real. The phenomena is this perception that we...
Yeah, so I don't know why he created the dichotomy between the phenomenon and the real, because the phenomenon for Kant isn't in opposition to the real. And this is actually one of the largest and biggest mistakes, I think, when reading into Kantian philosophy, is that you think that the noumenal phenomenal distinction that Kant had, I'm going to take it on charity, I guess, that most of the people watching this stream have watched me before, so they know what the noumenal phenomenal distinction is. That it's the same thing as the appearance reality distinction. Kant never says this. Kant never says that there's no identity between the categories of the understanding and the world. The point is that there is, depending on what type of interpretation, and I think the only sound interpretation of Kant is that the categories of thought that we have also have some sort of metaphysical export. That is to say that the world is in some sort of way structured as the categories of understanding seem to make sense of it, but just not exclusively in that sort of sense. That there seems to be something tacked on more to it that we'd call the noumenon. That is to say that representations of the world are always going to analytically presuppose, just in the notion of representation, something that it's representing. That we do have a direct sort of connection to, and that's just the role of intuition, actually, for Kant, is that the direct immediate perception of certain types of objects with an intuition. It's that they always have to be structured by certain types of concepts, sure, but that doesn't mean that we're not getting something about reality that's actually there. It just means that we're not getting all of reality. And in a sort of sense, Kant does bar us from actually ever being able to get to reality in the full sense. So, yeah.
We all have. It is this understanding of reality in which we construct. It is why I see in front of me a camera. It is why you see in front of you a screen. It is the difference between seeing the raw splashes of color, the data, and the understanding of that thing. Because right now, you know that when you look at that screen, that it is comprised of electric circuits, lights, that it is being powered by the mains power supply that it's plugged into. None of that is available to you in your pure perception. It's available to you after the fact of conceptualization. It is available within conception. And so when we look at science and its analysis, what we will find at the bottom of each and every single analysis, when we see something other than pure sense data, is a concept, is an idea, is an abstraction of mind applied to that object. And so at the bottom of all normativity, of science itself, of this objective investigation, we will see consciousness. We will see thought. We will not see a world that is external. We will see that a world that is actually internal in many ways. Mind cannot be overcome. It's not something that we should be trying to overcome. We don't try to remove all aspects of conceptualization from reality, because if we did, then what we would be left with is nothing. So this doesn't mean that I reject science. I actually love science. I wanted to be a physicist before a philosopher. I find it highly interesting and incredibly insightful. And there's nothing in this that prevents anything like physics from functioning properly. If anything, it's just understanding what physics is and the foundations from which physics relies, and the normativity at the bottom of everything. And since this normativity cannot be divorced from our experiences of reality, when we try to conceptualize of a cause prior to mind, what we are going to be conceptualizing as prior to mind is going to contain mind. The object that is prior, that causes mind, actually is fundamentally a construction of mind. So how could it be prior? How could it have caused mind to exist?
So there's I think in the speculative realist tradition, we get this, and don't quote me on this, I think that the concept was archetyme, a time prior to consciousness. Because it seems quite clear to me that there is a sort of causation or a sort of sequence of events that gave rise to causality, that gave rise to the mind. So I'm not really sure why anyone would ever say that causality would have to exist only dependently upon the mind. Surely there are all sorts of events that are going around in the world that cause each other to occur. That isn't just a sort of projection of the mind. So I'm not really sure what he's saying here.
When its existence has been caused by mind. This is why Sartre, in response to psychology, in particular Freudian psychology, says this: it is futile to invoke pretended laws of consciousness, of which the articulated whole would constitute an essence. A law is a transcendent object of knowledge. There can be consciousness of a law, not a law of consciousness. This is why we can never prove a law-like construction, such as determinism, to actually operate upon human behavior, upon human thought and action, because ultimately it is an expression of human thought and action, and everything that it investigates metaphysically is a construction of human thought and action. So as you can see, there can never be a law-like generalization placed upon human thought and behavior. A point made beautifully by Alistair McIntyre, who shows that there are 4 modes of unpredictability that can never be overcome within human life. The first he talks of is one created by Karl Popper, and it's one which relies upon radical conceptualization. He takes radical conceptualization to be the creation of a new concept, something that is entirely brand new, something that has not been formed from putting 2 concepts together, but is actually something brand new, has never been thought of, a new idea. And what he says is that this can never be predicted. And the example he gives is this. Imagine that we are in the Stone Age. One of us predicts that in the next 10 years, there will be the creation of a wheel. The companion with us says, well, wait a minute, what is a wheel? And so one of us turns around and says, a wheel is, and with great detail explains what a wheel is, the way it functions, the way it looks, everything about it. And so we stand aghast because we have just invented the wheel. And so this could never be predicted, because the prediction itself would include the prediction of the concept. It would not be the case that the wheel would be invented in 10 years, because at the moment of prediction, it would have been invented. The second point of unpredictability for McIntyre is our inability to predict our future thoughts and behaviors. We can never know what we will think next, because if we did know what we were thinking next, then we would have thought it now. What we think next is temporally absent within our mind. I cannot know what I will think next, because if I did know what I would think next, then I would not think that, I would think something else. I can never know what is going to occur next in my own mind. And this leads on to the next point, which is how this impacts game theory. Game theory is essentially the prediction of your opponent's behavior predicting your behavior. The unpredictability of game theory is based upon the fact that I do not know how I will respond to your future response. So even if I'm able to predict your response, I have to be able to predict my response to your response, to my response, which means that there is an inherent unpredictability presented by my response and your response ad infinitum. And the unpredictability of this scenario grows and grows, which is why it's so significant that the Grandmaster is 8 steps ahead, because that level of prediction.
So maybe I'm missing something, but I don't see what the relevancy of saying that one can't predict their own behaviors. I mean, to a certain extent, you can predict your own behaviors. I can anticipate how I'm going to shoot a rifle if I'm experienced with a rifle. Maybe to an extent that there's a degree of novelty within my experience. I'm not necessarily sure how I'm going to talk about it, but the idea that there aren't certain types of psychological experiments done, especially with some longevity, how people act or behave is seems really ludicrous to me. And the idea of bringing up game theory, I don't understand that either, because the entire idea of game theory is to be able to predict, or at least try to find some level of probability greater than zero of what people are going to do with their behavior. So I'm not really sure what the purpose of this is.
Is impressive. The way I like to think of this is with body language. Body language is supposed to be a symbolic representation of an individual's internal state. Through analysing someone's body language, I'm supposed to be able to gain information about them and their psychological state. So if someone has crossed arms, I know that they are defensive and perhaps a little unconfident. If someone has open arms, I know that they are open and confident. Apparently. But since I know that everybody knows about body language, I know that an individual can fake their body language. Take, for example, if I'm an interviewer and I'm interviewing someone. Someone does not want to be perceived as nervous because they think that would jeopardize their position within the company or their ability to obtain a position within the company. And so they sit with their arms open and they pretend to be confident. That does not necessarily make them confident. It makes them portraying confidence. And so there's a game going on. There's a game going on in every aspect of our lives in relation to body language and how we are appearing to the other. The last point of unpredictability for McIntyre is what's called contingency, in which we just do not know how an individual will react to certain unforeseen or unforeseeable events. So if there's something which happens to an individual that could not have been predicted.
Sorry, I'm pausing this to read Ancient Shower's comment right here. It's an epistemic argument for the underdetermination of awareness of future behaviors. Okay, sure. Yeah. I think that's a better way of phrasing this argument, is that all past events, they of course have to if you believe in the problem of induction, because that's just what the problem of induction is that all inductive statements are going to underdetermine the facts of future predictions. Although, although since I do believe in universals, I think there's a sense of where these underdetermination arguments are generally pointing to, this isn't necessarily an argument as much as it's just a pointing towards this direction. I had a conversation with John about this. There's a sense of where underdetermination arguments point to a universal concept or a law-like structure, at least within nature, I think. So if we look at prior, it's just this old story. If we look at prior scientific models, like say the Newtonian one, say like maybe early Einsteinian ones or Aristotelian ones, and then we have a general, or like, just Copernicus's model of nature. There's a certain sense of where these scientific facts obviously underdetermine the world, but that underdetermination, I think, sort of points as well, as long as you believe in greater and greater approximations, a sort of tightening of our concepts towards a universal concept or a law-like concept. I don't think what we're supposed to get from underdetermination is that we're just sort of fucked and that's it, right? I don't think that the idea behind any sort of scientific consensus, unless you're a heavy anti-realist, is that these models are just models all the way down, right? And we're not getting any closer to truth or any closer to any sort of body of knowledge which would work in a law-like manner. But of course there's going to be an underdetermination aspect of for our knowledge with respect to inductive claims, because that's all that inductive claims attempt to do, right? They attempt to get at all, they attempt to generalize all the available particular inductive perceptions that we have. But the idea that we work in this sort of classic empiricist scheme is dubious. So, yeah, of course, that inductive claims are going to be insufficient.
The theory of prediction could not have included this. Take Paris meeting Helen of Sparta. Helen of Sparta, looking the way she did, was unpredictable to Paris. Could not have predicted that Paris would have had the reaction he did to Helen's face. In fact, Helen's face, the face that launched 1,000 ships, would then result in a myriad of future events. The Trojan Wars and the fall of Troy inspired Homer to write the Odyssey. The Odyssey going on to inspire many Greek philosophers such as Plato to be the bedrock of Western civilization and philosophical thought, which has been incredibly influential on philosophical and literary endeavours. No one could have predicted that Lord of the Rings would have been produced by the birth of a Spartan woman. In this way, the smallest trivialities can have an immense importance within our life. But if a theory cannot predict human action, how can determinism be true? Determinism, as Alex said, is a positive claim.
Now, this doesn't absolve me of any burden of proof. Unlike my passive atheism, I make the active claim that I think free will does not exist.
In which it argues that human action is predictable, can be understood, and is epistemologically possible to be predicted. But what these unpredictabilities have shown is that these are logically impossible to be predicted, that these can never be predicted. Alistair McIntyre says, "We have then 4 independent but often related sources of systemic unpredictability in human life. It is important to emphasize that not only does unpredictability not entail inexplicability, but that its presence is incompatible with the truth of determinism in a strong version. If that is the case, determinism cannot be true, because no law like generalism..."
I think I sort of get the argument here that's sort of parallel to yours, Ancient. There is an underdetermination argument here, obviously, being presented, and I think it's being presented. It's being presented basically from the problem of induction heavily. I'm not really sure if anything here is particularly novel in that sense, though. The lack of, you said a person's mental behavior is not reducible to physical events because they involve distinctive properties. The lack of knowing future actions via causal and temporal asymmetries promotes the feeling of free action via one. I'm not really sure what you mean by causal and temporal asymmetries. You're gonna have to elaborate a little bit more on Paul Horvich's argument.
Could ever develop to predict human behavior. Psychology and sociologists, as they try, will never be able to predict human behavior. Economists will never be able to predict the next recession with accuracy that...
I think what he maybe means to say is that they will never be able to find out the necessary consequences of the antecedent conditions. That is to say that he's basically denying necessitarianism here. He's not denying determinism.
That is 100%. There will never be a theory of human behavior and action, in which case it can never be true. It can never be shown to be true. There we have it. Determinism is a theory which relies upon a contradiction in which supposes that a mind could construct an object which could come before it. So determinism is debunked. And so we now have what is known as the problem of indeterminism. So what we've learned here is that nothing can cause mind, nothing can come prior to mind, that everything in which we think is a prior cause to mind is actually a construction of mind. Well, that's great, determinism's untrue. We must have free will then. No. So as Alex pointed out, that just because our minds haven't been determined doesn't make us free.
So free will, according to this compatibilist, can be defined simply as the ability to do what you want to do. This seems plausible at first, right? If you can do whatever you want, you're a free being. But there's a problem with this. And the problem I'm thinking of was highlighted well by the pessimist philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, who pointed out that, yeah, sure, you can do whatever you will, but you can't will what you will, right? I mean, imagine that you wanted to save money, and so you put some funds into a bank account. According to Hobbes, so long...
Isn't it you can't will what you want? Did he get that quote wrong?
As nothing external to you was compelling you or restricting you, you acted totally freely in depositing the money. But did you choose to want to save that money? Could you, if you so please, choose to want to waste the money instead? And that's not the same thing as simply choosing to waste it. Could you choose to want to waste it? I certainly can't choose to want to waste my own money. And even if you could choose to want it, crucially, in order to do so, you would need to want to do it. And if you could control that want, you'd need to want it, and so on forever. Schopenhauer's point is that the ability to do whatever you want can hardly be called freedom if you can't freely choose what it is that...
Yeah, this supposes that there's an infinite regress of desires. Of course, if you're a Kantian, or if you believe in some sort of inner nature, that regress is going to end in something obvious, that is your innate nature. If you're a Kantian, it's going to end, at least within some degree, let's say that you're an ethicist, with a sort of unconditional principle, a categorical imperative that we have to follow, which is particularly what I believe.
You want.
So Sartre actually saw this spontaneity to be human freedom, which is why he says that we are condemned to be free. We can never be anything but indeterminate and trying to explain our actions and behaviors. All we are doing is positing causes that are untrue. We are putting essence prior to existence, and we are committing an epistemic failure. But I cannot help but feel shame when I am seen for Sartre. I cannot help but feel that I am being seen by the other. That when I see you and you see me, I understand that you are another individual who is a freedom external to mine, that you are a mind spontaneously arising from the nether, and that you make your own judgments, and that in those judgments I am an object for you, just as much as you are an object for me. So I am defenseless against your judgment. I can never do anything to change it because it is always absent within my reality. Your judgment is your judgment. It exists in your mind, in your freedom, just as my judgment is my judgment. And so we become entangled in this desire to be seen as what we want to be. We wish to appear a certain way. I want to be presented as the thing from which will gain your approval, which will make me feel pride, or I want to be seen as that thing which you hate. Either way, I wish to be the author of my actions because I feel shame or pride. The issue is I can't. And so there is no resolution here for Sartre. All of our actions are sadomasochistic. I'm either trying to modify your perception of me, or I'm trying to conform myself to your perception of me. So I pretty much am doomed to this inauthentic life. And the reason which we cannot free ourselves from this.
There's definitely a third between a sort of antagonism of which I force myself upon you, or you force yourself upon me, and when there's mutual recognition. This is in Hegel and maybe even in Sartre, of where the other person doesn't force themselves upon me, but I let up or understand the other person's perspective, and then in virtue of their reason-giving or thought-provoking propositions, I adopt these, and then we have mutual, sort of mutual understanding. So
this is because all concepts for Sartre have not been chosen. All of my judgments from which I judge reality and myself have not been freely chosen. They've been given to me through the conceptualization process which has led to language. I've been born into this language. To use a Heideggerian expression, I am thrown into this world, into this phenomenal experience from which I understand reality. There is an absence of me within the concepts I use. The only me that is truly free is in that unintelligible world. So I am either caused by the concepts I use, in which I sacrifice myself to language and exist in a life of bad faith, or I am a spontaneous being who is unintelligible to others and to myself, acting as a beast within the world. And so Sartre seems to be agreeing with Alex here in saying that we are never free. In fact, he goes on many times and says that I am enslaved. And so Sartre says, I am not what I am. And I think that is what Alex is saying when he talks about desire. That we cannot want what we want. I cannot own my desires because my desires are what I am. And so to say that I desire something other than what I desire is impossible. I could not choose something else. I am whatever I desire. But Sartre is kind of cynical. Sartre doesn't think that there is any unification between individuals that could ever occur. He doesn't think that our judgments could ever align, but they can, because we are rational agents and we can come to the same rational conclusions. And so we move on to the next point. What is freedom?
yeah, that last
So
part
what Alex has shown us in his video, and very nicely done by the way, it's not enough to simply be unrestricted, to get whatever we want in this Hobbesian sense. Now, just because we get what we want doesn't mean that we caused what we want. He's also shown that in an indeterminate sense, even if we weren't caused, if we are causeless, well then, how can we say that it's what we want? We didn't choose what we want, and so we are subject to what we want. I am a slave to whatever I am. I can't decide to change what I am. I just happen and spontaneously enact my desires upon the world as best as I can. This is where free will is said to be impossible, because if we are indeterminate or determinate, either way, we are not the cause of ourselves and our actions and our behaviors and our thoughts, and so we are not free. So although the indeterminacy from which we arise may seem absolutely contradictory to freedom, it isn't. and can be best understood as the precondition of choice necessary for freedom. Think of it like this. When you act within the world, that is the possibility, that is the scenario, that is the moment in which you get to choose between two options. You get to make the decision. Now, when you make that decision, if you have no structures of meaning, language, no ability to deduce what is right, then your choice is random. However, if you commit yourself to the rational life, to the life that respects reason in its true form, its ability to be deduced by any agent, it's unbiased and objective. In that sense, if we can support our actions and our behaviors with a series of reasons, and we act in relation to those reasons, then we are free. This is a point made very well by Dr. David Edward Rose in Phil and Continental Philosophy. It's a very useful resource which will explain this view in detail and in a way that's concise and easy to understand. So the point that he makes is actually in reference to Hegel. Hegel understands freedom to be a rational process, the process in which we can choose what.
So a question that was asked on the chat room right here. Our want to satisfy intellectual curiosity is what leads to reaching rationalized agreements, though, right? Couldn't it be boiled to scratching an itch? Well, it depends. I mean, it depends on how reductive you want your theory of how reductive you want terms like propositional statements or propositional beliefs to be, or just call it as I guess what you will. You can call it knowledge, right? And then sort of a justified true belief. Let's say that I have a justified true belief. If we're talking about justified true beliefs, there are obvious. These are obviously going to be a set of propositions, right? Because you can't just have one propositional statement, one belief that's justified, because in virtue of what is that belief going to be justified? The idea is that in order to have a justified true belief, well, you'd have to justify that belief in virtue of something else, something that gives it merit or demerit or both. Presumably an array or a sort of web or a constellation of other types of commitments. And when one does this, one sort of epistemically justifies their beliefs. They're not going based upon desires necessarily, but other good reasons in order to justify their beliefs. So let's say that I have, let's say that I want to adopt the belief that intellectual curiosity is a good thing. Well, I'd have to find certain types of merits or demerits why intellectual curiosity is a good thing. I could feel a certain type of way, but that won't necessarily convince me. I might have to find epistemic good reasons for why intellectual curiosity is a good thing. And there's a battery of reasons, as we sort of know. Now, one could say that all of this is just a dispositional property that's being expressed by the brain, right, and have a form of expressivism. Or one could sort of reduce this to a sort of inclination or a scratching of an itch, which would just be a form of emotivism. But this is exactly what's debated within philosophy. We can't just say that these reasons that we're giving forth for our beliefs are necessarily just causal features of the world. They're more than that. They're reason-giving features of the world. They're going to have merit and demerits. They're propositional, not just dispositional. And so the reductive style of certain types of philosophy is what's going to be really debated upon this issue right here. So, yeah.
Gives significance and meaning to a series of actions and makes significant our lives. So what's important to understand about Hegel is that Hegel does not see freedom and reason as being attributed to an individual, but to a group. In other words, when we work together to try and work out a shared goal, a shared dilemma, then we are capable of actually helping each other obtain freedom. Freedom is often seen as a moment, the moment in which we choose to do something. But freedom is the reasons from which we choose to do it. It is the meaning behind our actions. It is the ability to qualify why I acted that way, and to say how I will act in the future because of said reasons. It is the ability to differentiate between what is a good desire and a bad desire. In this way, when I choose radically my end goal and what structures of meaning to enter into, I set forward an agenda, I set forward a way of behaving, I set forward a future series of actions. But I can reinvent myself at any time. I can choose to reject a certain desire, to accept another one. I can choose to act in any way, shape, or form within this conceptual schemata, which gives my life meaning. So in this way, an individual can be their own author. They can engage with other individuals to actually understand themselves and come to rational conclusions with other individuals within our communicative environment. In fact, the communication necessary for concepts to function is implicit within an ethical relationship between two individuals in which they approve or deny the usage of each other's conceptualization. And Wittgenstein rightly showed the language games in which we play. The problem is...
So Ancient basically says he is, believe it or not, right about this particular point. Discarding the idea, believe it or not, or we're not incredulous. I think I would agree with the idea that freedom is not going to be something that is sort of generated out of the blue. You might be able to make a good argument that in order to have freedom, one needs other people. Because the type of freedom that we're talking about generally that's irreducible is of propositional content and of certain types of beliefs that are propositional and normative. And in order to have that, you need a language. And in order to have a language, you need other people, because you need at least a dynamic relationship of other people talking with each other in order to construct a language. Unless you believe in some sort of hypothesis like Noam Chomsky's, that languages actually originated from a private sphere and then entered into a public sphere. But if you're a good Wittgensteinian, you'll invert that image, right? You'll think that the private sphere is created by at least one type of private sphere, not all types of private spheres, at least the ones that when we talk about linguistic norms, are created through a sort of public exchange, through a sort of community. And that, if and only if that does find itself into creating a linguistic game for us and a set of propositional norms, we can adopt those we can adopt that sort of language game into our world, and then we have a sort of free will. And so how does that really kind of vibe with the idea of Hegel? Is that, well, this language is going to require a dynamic relationship with other people. It's going to require creating a language dynamically through recognition of other people.
How much game is involved? And what's the goal of the game? Is the goal mutual or is it individual? Because if it's individual, then the propositions I reject or deny have nothing to do with truth. They have to do with my asserted truth, whatever I think or want to be the case. And so we can end up in Sartre's sadomasochistic relationship. And so for the last section of this discussion, we will be engaging with the problem of ideology. So what the previous sections have taught us is that determinism is untrue, that we are indeterminate, spontaneous eruptions of consciousness engaged in a conceptual schemata that can be authored by ourselves and by others. But ultimately, it needs to be co-authored to be free. If the narrative is anything other than co-authored, it will be mistaken, it will be false, it will be asserted. There will be no objective standards to hold our concepts to. We need to engage with universals rather than assert individualistic particulars to take their place. And so Hegel and McIntyre have shown that we can be at home within this narrative. But is this just a feeling? Do we just feel as if we are agreeing with the socio-political environment? That the conclusions that we reach are our own when they aren't ideologically embedded within us? Nietzsche brought to light how ideology affects our ethical judgments. He showed that in the genealogy of morality and in many of his other works, that we can trace back an underlying power structure through all of our conclusions. Nietzsche saw truth as nothing more than a currency. He saw it as ideological power fluctuating to and fro within agents, that they represent the desires and the wants of various agents engaged within this sadomasochistic relationship. And so for Nietzsche, we are all players in a game, and the goal of the game is to triumph over one another, to have the will to power to triumph over any and all opposition. But then what is truth? It doesn't exist. In fact, all of the arguments in which Nietzsche gives are dependent upon truth to exist. He's reliant upon a normativity which is ungrounded, which exists in between agents in a form of conceptual uncertainty. It only appears to be the case. It isn't the case. And so there is no reason to believe Nietzsche over anybody else. He is just one out of many aesthetic ideals, which I don't think you'd have a problem with. But as McIntyre points out in his rejection of Sartre, this is itself a normative claim. There's no reason to believe that we cannot have truth and normativity if we are relying upon normativity to conclude that. So ultimately, we are committed to normativity. There is no escape. There needn't be an absolute rejection of this normativity. This normativity can obtain truth, but it could be ideologically constrained. That means that there may be fragments of truth in it, aspects of truth, but these are tainted through power structures. And this is the point of Karl Marx. In Marx's critique of Hegel, he shows that Hegel is right in one respect. People do produce ideas. We do produce our institutions. But he shows something else to be the case. Just as much as people produce ideas, ideas produce people. And so what we have throughout all of the institutions of our lives is an underlying power structure. And as he points out, in our current society, capitalism permeates everything. It is involved in all of our institutions, involved in our ways of thinking and our ways of being and our ways of living. Fundamentally, we are capitalists. We are socio-historically embedded. Not something that Hegel would disagree with, in fact. Hegel would absolutely agree. The primary difference between Hegel and Marx is his belief that the institutions which we now occupy are incapable of obtaining truth in any meaningful sense. They have aspects of truth within them, but they are blinding us ideologically from the truth. And so what we need to do is remove those power structures. We need to remove that ideology to gain any notion of freedom. The problem of ideology is that I cannot understand anything beyond it. Ideology is my way of thinking. It is this way of being. It is the judgments we make. And so the conclusions I reach may very well have been placed there through an ideological format. We're all living in an environment which is hierarchical, which produces norms and conventions which allow us to understand ourselves and behave within the world. And so when I associate my identity with a given structure of meaning, I am then trapped in that structure. To be understood is to conform to the normative environment, and to conform to the normative environment is to conform to the power structure that produced.
So what are your thoughts on Wittgenstein? It's been a while since I've read Wittgenstein. I read the Philosophical Investigations and the Tractatus like about 3 or 4 years ago. I did like what I saw about it. I especially like the private language argument, but I couldn't talk too much on Wittgenstein confidently in order to assert whether all aspects of his philosophy are true or not. I don't like the idea of quietism or that there are no real, genuine philosophical problems. That seems to be wrong to me.
So the question is, how do we free ourselves? Do we revolt? Well, no, because if we revolt, that's just the Sartrean rejection. We reject the structures of meaning and we are indeterminate. Do we accept this ideology? Well, no, if we accept this ideology, then we are being caused by something other than ourselves and we are not free. Can we get out of this ideological prison? The solution to ideology comes to us in the form of hermeneutics, in which we analyze the concepts we have and rationally engage with them and one another to see whether they actually obtain truth value or whether we are being manipulated by the power structure. However, when we use this hermeneutic analysis from universal to individual to universal again, there can be blind spots in ideology. We cannot conceptualize certain aspects of our ideology which are constraining us. We may be unaware of them because we are being manipulated to the nth degree. And this is where the philosophy of Slavoj Žižek and many other continental philosophers comes into play. Žižek understands that there is aspects of reality in terms of ideology which go beyond our immediate perception. That when we look at reality, what we are seeing is a spectacle. We are seeing a upside down inverted image of reality and not reality itself. And this isn't necessarily something that we can just snap out of. It's also not necessarily something that we can just analyze our way out of either, because we need a form of analysis which is, although rational and historically progressing, it must also have a goal and an understanding of how to identify certain ideological features of our reality. It's not enough that it is able to self-correct. There must be a self-correcting methodology which is ultimately allowing us to progress towards freedom. Žižek talks about what are called the sublime objects of ideology. This is a combination of a few philosophical points. Sublime being transcendent of our reality, something that we do not reach and cannot know in itself. Object is obviously to be an object, to be something which is actually to be understood. And ideology is, as it sounds to be, the structure of ideas and concepts which confine our thinking, the limitation to our possibilities. In such, he identifies that there are sublime objects of ideology. For example, he sees the Communist Party in the USSR as being a sublime object of ideology, something which dictates and outlines the ideology for everyone else, and is such the spontaneous eruption of ideology within the universal mind that is this shared ideological consciousness. It is the locus point. It is the point in which allows us to understand everything, okay? And so to see it is to basically look at oneself. You have to be able to, there are certain points that we miss when we look through our eyes, for example. When I look through my eyes, I cannot see my eye. I cannot see what I'm looking through, but what I'm looking through determines what I see. And so do these sublime objects of ideology. They determine what we see, but we cannot see them. But this, for Žižek, allows us to create a methodology based upon Lacanian psychoanalysis, which allows us to understand these objects and overcome them. Lacan was a French psychoanalyst who wanted to bring back the work of Freud. And he also married a lot of what Freud did with continental philosophy and other pursuits that he actually engaged within. And so he believed Freud was right and created his own Freudian theory. And he relied upon what were called 3 registries to understand the human psyche. These registries were the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. They pretty much can be taken at face value here. So the imaginary is your imagination, your ability to have radical conceptualization and thought processes. The symbolic is language, when we apply a concept to the world, when we communicate with one another, when we symbolize an object. The real is the object. The real is reality in its unsymbolized state. It is that which is ultimately resistant to our symbolization and therefore kind of unknowable. But it's also kind of knowable, which is very much Hegelian. And why I'm in love. We live in, for Lacan, a symbolic world. In fact, our very unconscious is structured like a language. And so when an individual has a...
See, I think that last part was true, but in opposition to what he said earlier. So that's sort of weird. And I think I think it might also just be the sort of common sense default view that we can get at the world a little, and sometimes not at all. There's just aspects of it that are unknown unknowns. There are aspects of it that are known unknowns, known knowns and unknown knowns, as Žižek sometimes says.
Psychological problem. The problem can be analyzed through analyzing the words that they use. There is a separation between the words that I speak.
Is there a rational argument against quietism that isn't just intuitive? If you're solving any sort of problems within philosophy and you think you have a solution to, say, the problem of universals, the problem of induction, if you think that's a problem, if you have a supposed solution to how the world isn't a material, just made up of material efficient causes, if you're a conceptual realist, I mean anything, right? If you're talking about anything in philosophy that can't be broken down in terms of just common sense, ordinary natural language, then I think that you're going to sort of reject the idea of quietism. So I don't see why that is just an intuitive argument unless you have something more in mind for what quietism is. Top tweak.
And my meaning, and that separation can be identified, but I cannot identify it. I need another individual who can show me the pattern, who can show me through analysis what I truly mean, the meaning hidden within my enunciation. It is in Lacan that we recognize that the real, that represents the unsymbolized, unknown agent, can be known in the absence of the symbol. And so the paradoxical nature of individuals and society are very similar. It is in difference itself that we can gain information. Hegel shows that being and nothingness are one and the same thing in terms of our ability to understand them. In and of themselves, they are infinites. And being such, they are unknowable. He gives an analogy in the phenomenology. When you walk into a room that is bright white and blinding, or you walk into a room that is pitch black, is there a difference? In both cases, you are blinded. There is no information you can gain because they are infinitely unknowable. There is too much data. There is no ability to differentiate. But what you can do is differentiate a bright white room and a pitch black room. And because of those differentiations, when there is an absence of light, you gain information that is non-infinite and knowable. And that's why it is in becoming that we understand reality. Within the destruction of the immediate experience and the movement towards the absence of the immediate experience, the movement between being and nothingness, that we actually understand determinate objects for Hegel. It is not, we do not understand the thing in itself. We understand parts of the thing, moving us towards understanding more and more of reality to a greater degree, as we synthesize to a greater degree the determinate aspects. We get little parts, we'll put them together, and we put together a big unified whole. We don't look at the universe and know it for what it is. We instead look at little parts of the universe, little parts of our perception, break it down, put them together, and expand our worldviews. But the important thing to take away from this is this point of difference being fundamentally the way in which we acquire knowledge. And this is the same for Žižek and Lacan.
Yeah, so sorry, I'm pausing all the time. So this is exactly what I sort of disagree with, that the quietist perspective is just dispositional. It's just an attitude. It's just a sort of perspective that we take, not a position itself. And this is exactly what I think I don't necessarily get, is you can't just have an attitude without committing yourself to some sort of beliefs that are going to be, in the end, justified or non-justified. And virtue of them being non-justified, you have good reasons not to be a in virtue of them being non-justified, you have good reasons not to be a quietist. Now you could say something like, okay, there's a pre-philosophical realm. Before we even enter into philosophy, we just have certain types of beliefs. We're not going to get rid of these beliefs. Just because a skeptic is coming up to us doesn't mean that we're going to in some way believe that the tree right in front of my house is not there, or something like that, right? And there's a sort of equanimity, according to the ancient Greeks, about this, right? The Bronians. So what do they do, by the way, in case someone's not familiar with their philosophy that Ancient is bringing up, is that these were a form of, this was a form of skepticism basically within the ancient Greek world, of where one gets one idea, say that you believe in universals, and then the other person gets the nominalist, is a nominalist about universals, right? That they don't exist, or you're a conceptualist or whatever. So these two beliefs that stand in opposition to each other have no real philosophical answer to which we can choose between these two. And that just goes all the way down to all philosophical questions, right? That all of this and this and this is just really, all these philosophical questions are irresolvable. And this also, obviously, in some sort of way, has a lot of symmetry with modern day quietism, especially the sort of Wittgensteinian quietism. And it is true. I mean, there is a sense of equanimity if you believe that that's true and you provide good reasons for why it's true. But I think if you provide good reasons to show how philosophy does aid within science, the sciences, biology, if you have a way of providing an answer to how processual ontology, for example, provides some sort of unique solutions to biology and how we look at things. If you look at just the history of philosophy, right, and we were to imagine a counterfactual situation of where no philosophy has ever existed, we can imagine that the world would be completely and utterly and hugely distinctively different, right? If Aristotle never wrote the physics, if he never wrote the metaphysics, if he never did any of those things, there would be no replies to those. There would be a whole different, probably, ideological structure of how we view nature. The idea that we can divorce philosophy from some sort of way from what happened within, say, the Enlightenment sciences, I think is sort of baffling. And the most baffling part that I think that we can't get away with is that somehow we can divorce our ethical systems that we have in any sort of country, particularly America, from, I don't know, Lacanian ethics or Kantian ethics. I think that would be sort of baffling, right? The idea that we can sort of imagine that without these great thinkers, these ethical systems would still be around. Because sometimes I hear people bring up, one of my good friends brings up and tells me, well, philosophy is not so important. Imagine a counterfactual situation of where all philosophy just stopped right now, just completely stops at this moment. Would we continue on with the future just fine? And if you ask that type of question, it's sort of hard to answer. Like, probably a lot of people would intuitively think, yeah, we'd get along just fine without philosophy from here on out. But if I think retroactively, right, if I think from the past to the future, that intuition that I have about the future from now is a lot different. Of course, the past would have been completely different. Of course, the present would have been completely different had the past not included philosophy. So I don't subscribe to the intuition that, of course, the world wouldn't be different in the future if we just got rid of philosophy right now. It would be probably different if we got rid of philosophy right now, because philosophy is on the threshold, I think, of a lot of theoretical positions that eventually concretize themselves and then begin to be a more developed science, or a more developed and concrete way of how we view the world in terms of ethics, right? If someone just happened to develop a new ethics that isn't deontology, utilitarianism, consequentialism, of course it's going to change the structure of how we view the world if those begin to be sort of implemented. So I don't believe in the quietists in the sense that you could just jettison the entire idea of a of a world fully fun. Sorry, let me rephrase this. I'm sick, so my thoughts are a little bit scrambled. So of course I would say that if you get rid of certain types of philosophical ideas, that it's going to remarkably have a change and an impact on the world. So yeah. How do you build your usual lectures? Been giving lectures on philosophy going through time, but I'm kind of lost with how to continue with all the branching post the Protestant Reformation. How would you approach a timeline going forward? Also, sorry for the completely unrelated question. Sorry. COVID. I think the answer to that question, because I've discussed a little bit about lectures and how to give lectures with obviously my colleagues and a few people in TPC, but I think that answer is going to be dependent upon what you're doing. So if you're teaching, say, an introduction to philosophy course, I'm not even sure if it's valuable to necessarily go through a chronological order of the history of philosophy, because A, the students are only going to get a very surface level understanding of all these thinkers, and two, they have, especially if they have no idea about anything about philosophy, they're not going to understand why these certain arguments are more or less stronger than other types of arguments. So if you come in there, and I have to sort of in a way, and come in there out of the blue talking about foundationalism versus coherentism and say theories of justification or theories of truth, I don't think they're going to understand anything about it other than, you know, a very surface level descriptive, assertive description of what those things mean. They have to learn what informal arguments are, how to use informal logic before they can even address these. Now, that's distinct from formal logic. I don't think a student needs to know formal logic in order to be able to find out how to reason or not how to reason, but they do need to know how to make use of informal argumentation. And this is why the philosopher, I never know how to pronounce his name, Sextus Empiricus, I think, that ancient brought up within the outlines, presents a series of arguments, a series of antinomies of two people kind of clashing at each other, and you are trying to discern which one's better. And I think that's a good way of studying philosophy. Now that I've sort of explored that idea, is that people have to be presented various arguments like that and have to begin finding out what is exactly logically erroneous or right about these different types of arguments that are being presented in this sort of narrative. But if you're trying to present a history of philosophy, more into the realms of just talking about history, you're focusing on just the history, and you're trying to find out how the transition between Kant and Fichte occurs, then you're going to have to probably dig into some level of autobiographies there, or at least some sort of exchanges between the letters, explain exactly what, I don't know, Germans thought, or sort of the philosophers of Germans thought about Kant in relation to Fichte when the transition was occurring. You have to be aware of the notable ideas that they're trying to overcome or trying to preserve. So, for example, the idea of intellectual intuitions, I'm not going to get into it, but this was a thing in the German idealists, whether we should believe in them or whether we should not believe in intellectual intuitions. And this is a sort of major concept that is latent within that type of tradition that one has to sort of understand to begin explaining things well. So I'm trying to teach a bunch of Twitch nerds why philosophy is interesting, how society has developed as a function of ideas. Yeah, well, that's what I'm here doing as well. So, outside of what I just said, and presenting a sort of an array of different types of arguments of which the audience has to choose from, and you give them a sort of narrative on how to talk about one argument or another type of argument, you're going to have to bring up the various positions, I think, articulate what those positions mean, go through what would merits and demerits look like for these various types of positions. And then if you really want to hit more home with history, you'd have to begin spinning something like, well, look at this time period and look at all of history of philosophy and look how the idea of, say, the philosophy of mind has taken place within all of the history of philosophy. There are all these various different views. What are these various different views? Eliminativism, reductivism, dualism, monism, whatever. This philosopher believed that, and this philosopher believes this. This is a sort of, I think, an interesting way of bringing up issues to people by making them well aware that this is a sort of challenging problem that has existed for hundreds of years. Why don't you follow a standard undergraduate survey style course? We've already talked about that, Ancient. We've already talked about, and I do have a sort of a survey course for my class. As a matter of fact, I'm thinking about changing the survey style course by starting with Sextus, because that was, I think, a pretty good suggestion brought up to me by one of my friends, Patrick. Are you endorsing the position that historical philosophy has simply been working towards a clarified logical method that permits us to skip the less good logical philosophy that itself led to the supposedly clarified logical method? No, I'm not advocating that historical philosophy has been working towards a clarified logical method, and it permits us to skip a less good logical philosophy. I don't know what that means, to be honest. What does it mean to say that a historical philosophy has been working towards something and it skips good philosophy? I don't understand. How is this position to be held together with the idea that there are other forms of study of philosophy? Is studying the history of philosophy, the pre-Socratics, for instance, the German idealists, something less logical, different? Is philosophy pluralistic? I don't know if I would say it's less or more useful. I mean, it's the second part of your question, I understand. It's a sort of interesting question. I don't know if I have an answer to that question, because the idea is, if I'm looking at Leibniz or Spinoza or Kant and Hegel, are these more important or less important than, say, analytic philosophy that tries to investigate things like the problem of universals, or the PSR, the principle of sufficient reason, or certain meta-ethical issues such as what is the ontological state of ethical propositions or ethics or whatever. They both, to me, seem extremely important, and they both seem extremely needed. The idea that one would want to divorce oneself from either of those, I don't understand why you'd want to limit yourself. I don't think one is less logical or more logical than the other, and I definitely see a dynamic relationship between the two. Or at least any philosophy that I've read in analytic philosophy, whether it be Korsgaard, whether it be Peacock, whether it be Michael Smith, I think, or Schaeffer-Landau. I always forget if it's Landau, Schaeffer-Landau. Pulls immensely from historical thinkers. And the historical thinkers can become more clear when you have a more refined vocabulary in analytic philosophy. So, I mean, stuff that I read in Brand helps me explicate one Hegel thought sometimes. What courses have you taught, Marty? Just intro? Yeah, I just teach intro. I would have to have a PhD to teach much more than that. Although I mean, they might allow me to teach ethics or an introduction to logic or a survey of the world's religions. Thanks for the answer. Gotta go walk the dogs now. Hope to deepen the conversation later or another day. You have a good one, Eka. Logic is a loaded term anyways. It is, logical is a loaded term anyways. Yeah, I'd say so. It's really hard to find out exactly what the term "that's logical" means.
Lacan says there is no meta-language, and what Žižek points out is that's because he takes it literally. Unlike the post-structuralists who understand there to be no meta-narrative which governs our way of thinking and understanding reality, he instead says there is no meta-language because there's no need for one. All language is object language. When I talk about language itself, I'm analyzing language as an object of my conversation. And this is because laws, no matter what they are objects. They are held by individuals and are available to consciousness. The very limits of language seem to elude us. But it is in these limits that we gain what language is. We can understand the limits of language in what we cannot speak about. And this is what Žižek is pointing out with ideology. Points in which we cannot gain knowledge and talk about our ideologies are the points in which we understand the sublimity of our ideologies, the points which exceed onwards. We start to grasp the real.
Now, I don't know if he intended this, but there's actually something I think kind of cool in that last phrase with the sublimity of our ideas. Because if you read someone like Kant, the idea of the sublime is that it's a particularly indeterminate phenomenon. What do I mean by indeterminate? I mean that it far reaches the notion of our experiences. It goes beyond our experiences. That is the exact idea of the sublime. It's sort of encountering something that is larger than our understanding, presses up against us, and then sort of goes beyond it, right? Which is distinct, I think. You know, I mean, like you look at the aesthetics of Kant, and it's distinct from his other aesthetic judgment, which was about beauty. And there's a sense of where the world does have this sort of sublime quality to it.
In the sense that it is resisting symbolization. But in its resistance, we are given the moment, the opportunity to construct and create a new symbol, a way to understand and reflect upon this resistance, upon this relationship between the symbolic and the real. And that gives us the point of analysis. This is the point in which the psychoanalyst is engaged in understanding the individual, and this is the point in which the political critic should be engaged within ideology. And so this gives us the opportunity to engage and take responsibility for our identities. When I say what I am, I mean what I am. But I am also aware that I am not what you take me to be. And so in that absence, in that difference, I can understand that there are aspects of myself, or aspects of reality, aspects of our institutions, which are not aligned with the expression of subjectivity. That the objective and subjective freedom is not in line, and I can see the paradoxical contradiction that exists between my trying to express freedom and my subjectivity being hindered by that expression. And so I seek to modify and change the ideological structure that is around us. But I cannot simply reject it, because then I am left in this meaningless mildew of infinite reality, and instead I have to work within it to construct new symbolic references, to create arguments and structures of meaning which allow us to create a greater and greater understanding of ourselves and our institutional environment. And as I do such, I can understand the corruption of power structures and the influence of ideology. I can understand that which is preventing me from undergoing this process. And so this is why for Hegel, we can understand that being a slave is actually a choice. It's not that Hegel believes that the slave put chains on his wrists and submitted himself to the master. It is the fact that a slave is only a slave when they accept the identity of being a slave. But in the moment that they accept this identity, they have the option to reject it. The slave has the option to become the freedom fighter.
Yo, 1 week's pay. It's the best I can do. Wait! Hey! You better find yourself someplace to hide and keep praying nobody ever finds you.
Try these on.
Look, you crazy mother.
And this is why freedom for Dr. Rose, for Hegel, for Žižek, and myself would be a process. It's a rational endeavor in which we engage with concepts to try and create, as much as possible, a free environment. There are points in which we are unfree, in which we are caused, and there are points in which we are free and are actually engaged within self-understanding and rational discourse to a way that actually reflects who we are and what we wish to achieve. So I hope this video has explained why I would argue for freedom. And so for a quick summary, here were the arguments. The first argument was that determinism is untrue. Determinism relies upon a structure of normativity which itself rejects. It tries to place an objective mind as prior to mind, denying the metaphysical relations between mind and reality and rejecting the phenomena which is impossible, and therefore determinism is untrue. The second point was on indeterminism. To be causeless is not freedom, but instead we must also have a content to our desires. These desires must be given their content willfully by the agent, otherwise the individual cannot be said to be free. We have to want what we want. The third point was to show how we can want what we want, that there are structures of meaning which we can align ourselves with, and that these structures of meaning can give reasons and justifications for our desires and actions. These reasons and justifications can themselves be corrupted by ideology, and that our process of trying to gain freedom can be our enslavement. It can be a reflection from ideological baggage produced by power structures. And finally, this is to conclude that this ideological structure can be itself analysed in the hermeneutic relationship between the individual and their language, the individual and their institutions, and that when we analyse our institutions and we analyse our concepts, we can come to rational conclusions about whether they are actually allowing us to express our identity to the greatest degree. Alex, if you think I've made a mistake at any point in this video and you would like to point out that determinism is in fact true and I am sorely mistaken, please go ahead and respond. I would love to hear back from you and have some feedback. Thank you all for watching, and as always, try to gain some perspective.
Yeah, so I don't think I agreed with a lot of that. I think I ended up disagreeing with quite a bit of that. I also think it's a sort of malnourished definition of idealism of the sort that I believe in, and I think it's a malnourished description of what he actually believes in. So it's a sort of interesting take. I think it needs to become a little bit more nuanced. So for anyone that's still here, I just wanted to, before I get on to sort of my own perspectives about why determinism really doesn't matter and it's not a threat to free will, wanted to inform everyone here that sorry about that I'm going to be having a conversation pretty soon, well, kind of soon, with I'm going to edit this in just a second, with Dr. Joshua Rasmussen. Maybe you guys who are watching this looks like I don't know how to spell February all of a sudden. I'm going to have a conversation with Dr. Rasmussen. What was it, February? I have to check the calendar. I think it's the first one. Yeah, it's February 3rd, 2021. Okay, cool. So Dr. Rasmussen is a professor. I forgot at which university. I'm going to have to look that up as well. Who teaches the philosophy of religion. He was on, I believe, Capturing Christianity. He had a conversation with Dr. Opie about God and the cosmological argument, maybe the ontological argument. He's also known for defending the correspondence theory of truth. And I've had a few conversations with him on the email, or at least one big conversation that sort of extended onto a few weeks, about several sort of issues relating to God, panentheism, the PSR, things like that, and actually about mereology to some extent. So I'm going to be having a conversation with him. I'm obviously going to have to talk about religion and God and all that, like I did in the video, since that's sort of what he specializes in. But I'm going to try to probably focus on a conversation with him that's going to also sort of brush into epistemology. That's also going to brush into issues that most people haven't talked, such as panentheism. I want to know why he's sympathetic, because he is. He told me that he's sympathetic to panentheism. That doesn't necessarily have to be the classic theistic God. That is, it doesn't necessarily have to be that God created nature and God is separate from nature and he has divine simplicity and all the divine attributes and all the sort of characteristics of an omnipotent, omniscient, yada yada, etc., etc. Sort of predications that we generally have, but he is also sympathetic to the idea of nature and God having some sort of identity, some sort of ontological parsimony. And I wanted to know why, because I'm a panentheist. I also wanted to know what his epistemology is and how he sort of justifies all the various types of things. And I also wanted to know why he holds the correspondence theory of truth. So I'll probably end up reading at least his book, Necessary Existence in the Future, and sort of take it from there. I don't know if I could, these people are obviously going to be much more well-learned than I am, so I'm not sure how much I'm going to be debating him or pressing him. I'm going to be pressing him somewhat, but I'm not going to be a bystander like a lot of other types of podcasts are, where I just ask questions all the time and they answer the questions and then nothing really gets resolved because people want some sort of dialectical tension, right? They want to know why these people believe in this, and they want to know what what they would reply with if these questions were hit to them, right? And there's a lot of tough questions, I think, that are just never asked. So I'm going to ask him hopefully some tough questions on February the 3rd. And another person that I wanted to speak with, although they gave me a firm maybe, since they're busy right now, and it's a sort of a bigger person in terms of a book celebrity of some sort, the author Ian McGilchrist. He wrote the book, I believe it was titled His Master and Emissary, and I read this book about 6 or 7 years ago. In fact, I've recommended this book on TPC before, about the nature of the left and right hemispheres and the profound asymmetry between the left and right hemispheres, and sort of their relation to how we experience, perceive, and attend to the world. How we attend to the world, apparently, according to Ian McGilchrist, is going to be very asymmetrical between the two different types of hemispheres. And there's a sort of caution that Ian gives in that this sort of asymmetry between the two hemispheres has been overly pronounced. That is to say that I don't know what the general slogan is that the right hemisphere is very creative and the left hemisphere is logical or something like that, which is a terrible misunderstanding of neuroscience and how the brain works. And so this isn't exactly what's going to be the focus of the conversation with Ian McGilchrist. It's rather to the degree of how the left and the right hemispheres attend the world. And the way that you can do it is, of course, by inhibiting one side of the brain to find out what ways that the subject would perceive the world, and what sort of is exactly missing when we take one of those perspectives out. And the sort of interesting thing is that one side of the hemisphere, I believe it was the left, and that was the one that was most focused with language, sort of views the world as an assemblage of parts, generally contextualized, generally propositional, generally as a series of objects, while I believe it was the right that, and it's been a while since I've looked into this, generally the right views things in a lived, embodied way, sees the world as always as a process, always as something incarnate, more of an organism instead of a machine, and more of a whole as an assemblage of parts. So it works sort of holistically, if you will. But if you don't buy into this perspective, and there's a lot of reasons why people would be hesitant, I do recommend reading the book, and I do recommend, if I have the conversation with Dr. Ian McGilchrist, to tune in on that conversation. That is probably going to be the most interesting conversation that I'll ever have on a podcast if it does happen. I immensely have high respect for the body of knowledge that Ian McGilchrist has. I mean, I think it was well over 2,000 sources within that book that I found very useful. It was actually one of the primary motivations for why I started doing philosophy, is because I was interested in the relationship between the brain and philosophy, and also phenomenology and history. I mean, he's kind of a champion of various different types of fields, and it's very nice that he's also a psychiatrist, because the very cordial nature of Ian is very nice to experience. So I haven't gotten a confirmation from Ian McGilchrist to say that he's going to be doing a podcast with me, although I have gotten a maybe. Excuse me. And then I'll have to contact them after March. And I do want you all to tune in for that one. Highly recommended. It's going to be over process ontology, the brain, neuroscience, and its relation to philosophy. He's a process thinker, which isn't surprising because he's a psychiatrist, and delves into quite a bit into the humanities and philosophy, and as well as poetry. He often gives poetry readings on his podcast, which maybe not many of you are interested in poetry, but you'd be interested in at least the other stuff. Yeah, like I said, when is this conversation on the hemisphere? Someone asked on the chat. So it's not confirmed. If it is going to occur, it's going to occur somewhere probably after March of next year. However, until then, I do highly recommend that everyone who listens to this podcast to go visit Dr. Ian McGilchrist's podcast, or at least not necessarily his podcast, but some of his lectures or some of his overviews of his book, which I found quite illuminating. But probably, I don't know all of the literature within neuroscience. It's much more complicated than my beliefs on it. Probably to some degree somewhat controversial, but damn it didn't really seem very controversial when I was reading it. It seemed very, very palatable. So are there plans for the future professional philosophers on podcasts? I hope so. I want to see how the one with Dr. Joshua Rasmussen goes. The reason I selected him and Ian McGilchrist is because I know they're very cordial fellows. I know they're very good at having dialectical conversations. Or sorry, at least Dr. Joshua Rasmussen is more of a dialectician than Ian. Ian's more of a sort of discuss this, and although he does have quite a bit of answers to just about everything, it seems like. Dr. Rasmussen is more of a dialectician that will probably play into more of a, how should I put it? I don't want to say a battle or anything like that, or an intense argument, but it will at least push at some ideas. We'll push at each other's ideas here and there, which I find fun. As long as it doesn't get it doesn't go overboard, because I've had conversations with people where it has gone overboard and it hasn't resulted in any sort of way, in any good way. Yeah, Dr. Ian. I think it was Dr. Ian. Was it two? Yeah, I think, yeah. Dr. Ian McGilchrist and his master, an emissary, I believe was the name of the book. I believe that was the. I don't want that. Was the book that I read about 6 years ago that really got me into philosophy. I'm sorry that the Nightbot removed one of your links there. Yeah, of course. Okay, so someone said if TPC is able to get interviews with well-known professional philosophers, it might help with marketing the server to an academic audience, which is true. I do want to get into contact with more academic philosophers. A lot of them are very frugal with their time, however. Thank you, Ancient. I hope I'll feel better as well. Right now, I'm not in the best of spirits. It's probably why my voice is a little bit lingery and monotonic right now. So, anyways, hopping back onto to the point of why determinism doesn't matter. So several perspectives that one can take about why determinism wouldn't matter too much to the threat of free will, and I've already gotten over some of these, but it doesn't necessarily seem, and someone could correct me. I'm sure Ancient might try to find some arguments off the top of his head to correct me of why this doesn't matter, but one of the sort of intuitive things that I thought that you can always bring up with people who want to say that we don't have free will is that there seems to be a distinct nature between the sort of causality involved between when I make choices that are based upon reasons that I have gone over, that I'm operating in accordance with. So if I'm operating with if I have an intentional action that is operating with a set of beliefs that I have that all cohere, that have all the sort of criterions of rationality, that is something like consistency, completeness, continuity, decompositionability, transitivity. These are sort of qualifications, if you will, for theories of rationality. If that all seems to cohere with that, if I have a set of beliefs that cohere and are rationally justified, and if I'm acting in accordance with good reasons when I'm intentionally acting, then there does seem to be a sense of where my intentions and my beliefs play a role in a sort of downwards causation. That is, they operate how my body is and how it functions. And that seems to be quite distinct from, say, someone pushing me and my body moving because someone else pushed me, or because I'm motivated by desiratariums or desiratariums. I can't even pronounce it right now. Basically things that, I desire. If I'm motivated by just desires and emotions, causal external influences of these sorts, these seem to be quite different from the sort of list of things from what I was talking about earlier. However, in both of these scenarios, whether I'm acting from good reasons as opposed to I'm acting because of emotions, emotive tendencies, or because of causal tendencies that influence me from the external world, both of these seem to suggest and are compatible with the idea of determinism. And there doesn't seem to be any sort of logical incompatibility. That is, there's no logical contradiction between me having a free will and being able to freely act, and there being a deterministic world. Whenever someone does spot what that logical incompatibility is, they can go ahead and tell me, and I'll revise my thoughts. Those don't seem incompatible in any sort of sense. So yeah, one has to sort of analyze the ontology, or the sort of nature of our actions. If they seem more in tune with the idea of a truck hitting me and causing my body to fling out of control, obviously I'm not responsible for that, and that's not an intentional action. Whereas acting in accordance with my desires, intentions, beliefs, and things like these, or at least my justified true beliefs, does seem to be more in line with operating freely. So, I mean, I don't think you need to say much more than that to sort of exit the thread of hard indeterminism, or hard hard determinism, not indeterminism. One of my roommates here in the background is going crazy. Oh, it's not that you're not allowed to post links. It's just that once I set up Nightbot, it's one of the things that it prevents are links. But I mean, maybe it's a good thing, because certain people would spam links here, and the links would go into some sort of website that would be against the terms of service that Twitch has. Anyways, I'm gonna push this into a Q&A real quick. We don't have as many people as we did earlier, but if anyone has sort of any questions, now would be a pretty good time to ask them in the chat room, because who knows the next time I'm going to be on here. It might be in February for all I know. So yeah. If anyone has any sort of questions before I head out and end the stream for today. While that's occurring, I did want to thank everyone who joined us for today's stream. Thank you for being here with me. Hopefully in the future we'll have some more guests to have a discussion with, maybe some internet celebrities. Within the foreseeable future, I'll also find out if I've gotten a PhD. Yeah, so we'll see how all that goes. might be the case that we'll have no questions here today. Do you have a newsletter or some other way to update us? Well, if you go to the Discord server, you'll be able to find out every single time I'm on. And that is just like discord/philosophy.com. As a matter of fact, I feel like I should probably change the website out, since the website on the bottom corner right here of the stream is no longer really exists. I've shut that down a while back ago. I was gonna write some blogs and things like that, but I got kind of over it. So yeah, again, like the Discord, very easy to find. Just go on Discord, put in the word philosophy. We are Discord/philosophy. Literally /Discord/philosophy. So we are the first to get that name. We are now officially partnered with Discord. We also are in Discovery, so you can find us in Discovery. If you guys have any questions about philosophy, there are plenty of people on TPC, the philosophy chat, who will be happy to answer some of your problems, some of which are way smarter than me. And I am often humbled by the erudition of some of our members and just how informed they really are. I might actually post a link. So yeah, I mean, it's literally, like I said, discord.gg/philosophy. So. Yeah, that's an interesting question, Brian. So the question is, do you think free will is necessary for actions to be praiseworthy? Read some Susan Wolf stuff where she talked about how good actions are praiseworthy irrespective of free will, yet you can't blame people for bad actions if we have no free will. I think it's true that ought implies can. If we can't freely act, then there's no sense of where we ought to abide to a certain set of ethical norms, because if we can't, then how can we say that we ought to? But insofar as we can, and there is a certain ethical standard in which we have to follow, we ought to follow it. But with the question of whether it's praiseworthy is another sort of interesting question, because take, for example, and you probably know this since you've asked this, Brian, Kant's position on it is that the only thing that's praiseworthy is a good soul. It's one in which the intentions of the person are in accordance with the sort of self-legislating unconditional principles that are constitutive of the moral agent. And unless they're acting in accordance with those reasons, then they're not really praiseworthy. I tend to be in favor of that type of view. I tend to think that if we're just accidentally doing certain types of things, that we're not really praiseworthy. I think that is to say, if we're working emotively, I don't think that should be worthy of praise. I would be happy to see what Susan Wolf's arguments are against that. Of course, there is an intuitive sense of where people want to praise others for doing certain types of good actions, even though they're not thinking about it ethically. And maybe, you know, it gives us a good feeling. I don't know if that gives us a good reason to be in praise of their behaviors. So. I'll wait one more minute and then I'll probably close down the chat for today. Just a reminder, if you guys can help out, please subscribe to the YouTube channel as well to the Twitch channel. Most of the content that is on the Twitch channel is then going to be uploaded to the YouTube channel, and I wish for the two to be connected in a sort of marriage. So. Yeah, I'm not sure how much I would buy into just a sort of largely intuitive construction such as that, Brian. Anyways, I will catch you guys later. That was, that's all for today. Thank you for again coming. Until next time, guys, you guys remain more safe than I have with COVID. Catch you guys later.